Okay, so we're going to go ahead and begin. Welcome to all of you. Tonight we're going to talk about the Rabbinic Bible. One of the themes of this talk is going to be just how much technology matters for how we experience Judaism and how we experience the tradition. I don't know if it was original with my dad, but he always used to say, don't pick a fight with somebody who purchases ink by the barrel, which is to say that people who own printing presses can be very powerful people. And they certainly were able to shape the way that Judaism is practiced today. Of course, the printing press really comes of age in the 15th and 16th century. Before that time, Judaism had been a culture of manuscripts, books that had to be copied by hand. And suddenly, not only did we have the possibility of making many copies of a given book, but it became possible to perhaps make a little bit of money with this, to make a few bucks. So I'm going to tonight talk a little bit about the history of this institution, the Rabbinic Bible, and I'm going to give a short guide to what's inside. You'll hear rabbis say we have a Rashi on this, we have an Ibn Ezra on this, we have a Rambam on this. What do we mean and what are we looking at when we study, and how all of this could change? You're taking this class about the Rabbinic Bible now, but we're actually at the end of probably the age of printing, and we're going into the digital age, and the question is, how does this change the way we experience Jewish texts? The first Rabbinic Bibles were printed by Christians in Italy. And this wasn't an accident. You had to, look, the church controlled the printing press. If a Jewish book was going to be printed, it was going to be edited and okayed by Christian authorities. But the people who printed and arranged these books were not just Christians, they were Jewish apostates. And so they would use their knowledge to create these books, many times with the goal of selling Jewish Bibles to Christians. This is a picture of the first Rabbinic Bible. It's actually very hard to see copies of this. It's an extremely rare book because it didn't do very well. It was too Christian-oriented. In fact, it was dedicated to Pope Leo by the people who printed it. But even though it was a failure, it set the tone for what would ultimately be a successful enterprise. And that would come 8 years later in, wait for it, the second Rabbinic Bible, which was edited by Jacob ben Chaim. Jacob ben Chaim was an apostate. He became a Christian, and he helped create this Bible that was published by Christians. But even so, this became a book which was very popular among Jews, and it introduced some things that we take for granted today in Bible study into the Jewish milieu. For instance, we take it for granted that there are chapters and verses in the Bible and in the Torah. When we read the Torah on Shabbat, you hear the Gabbai say, and we're on this page, we're on this chapter, and this verse. Those chapters and verses are not from the Jewish tradition. They're from the Christian tradition. But because they're a useful way of finding things in the text, they became incorporated into these printed rabbinic Bibles, and ultimately they were adopted by us to the point where I don't think many people even know that those are not Jewish divisions, that they are Christian. Not the divisions themselves are Jewish, but the numbering of the verses and the division into chapters is a Christian innovation. In order to sell more copies, you see several things are added here in the apparatus. I'll get my drawing tool to there we go. So the main text of the Torah, in the Torah in this case, but it could be the Bible, is right there. Along the side of it, I'll do it in red. I'll do it in red. This is the translation of the Torah into Aramaic. We have there's two ways that this is useful. I mean, the first is that at the time many of the rules of reading the Torah were given, Aramaic was the spoken language. And so if there became this liturgical institution of the translator, that the reader would read a verse in Hebrew, and then somebody would give a free translation of the verse into Aramaic. There's also a instruction from the Talmud that says that everyone, when they prepare the study of the Torah, the reality is that what you do is you read the verse in Hebrew twice, and then you read it in translation once. And so in order to do that, you need to have a translation nearby. What's interesting about this, of course, is that Aramaic is not spoken by Jews anymore outside of Syria or other communities. And therefore the question might ask, well, why not have the translation in a language that Jews actually speak? In this case, it could have been Italian, or in our case, it could have been English. But the fact is that the translation into Aramaic that's shown here, and in every Rabbinic Bible, it's the version of Onkelos, and it itself becomes a holy text, so that when this gets printed, rather than have a translation into the vernacular alongside the Torah, they have the classic translation into Aramaic, and this becomes a mainstay of every Rabbinic Bible. Also, we have a question of commentaries here, and the commentaries are added always with the idea of increasing sales. So you want to have a wide readership as possible. You want your market for the book to be as broad as it can possibly be. So maybe we should have an Ashkenazi commentator and a Sephardi commentator. We'll cover all of our bases. And that's exactly what happens in the Second Rabbinic Bible. We have one commentary by Rashi, and we'll explain a bit about who he was and what his commentary is. But Rashi, of course, is Ashkenazi from France. And we have another commentary from Ibn Ezra, who was born in Spain. He did not stay in Spain for all of his life, but he was brought up in the Sephardi environment, and so his commentary was popular among Sephardim. And so you cover all your bases and you try to sell as many copies as possible. And as I said, the Second Rabbinic Bible was a success. Many parts of it became the authoritative study Bible for Jews. When Christians were making translations, they used it. This was the version that was used by the people who did the King James translation. But also the format. We have the text of the Torah, we have the version of Onkelos, the translation, and we have some commentaries. This is the way, with some variations, it was always going to be done after this. And so this was a tremendously influential work. So I want to talk for just a minute about why it was important that the Second Rabbinic Bible determined the actual text of the Torah and of the Bible. As I said, at the time the printing press arrived, we were moving from an era of manuscripts. And, not every manuscript tradition is the same. I mean, unlike just printing something offset or using something digital to print something, you can make a mistake when you copy something over. And then when you copy a manuscript incorrectly, every copy after that is going to be incorrect. And so there emerged different families of manuscripts regarding the text of the Bible. These differences between these families of manuscripts were not huge. There weren't like versions where they weren't. We're really talking about a letter here, a vowel there, a dash here, in a real dramatic circumstance. Maybe the change of a letter that would alter the meaning of a word. But when you print something, you've got to make a decision about what you print. And the one that you choose to print is going to become very influential because you can make many more copies of it. There are two approaches to how you establish the correct text, the eclectic versus the diplomatic. And in various times, one of these traditions is more popular than the other. In the eclectic tradition, in the eclectic mode, what you do is you compare all of your manuscripts, and every time there's a variation, you choose the best reading from whichever manuscript has the best reading. And so it's chosen independently. I mean, sometimes the best reading might be in manuscript A, sometimes it might be in manuscript B, but whatever the best reading is, you're going to use that one. And the reason this is a nice thing to do from the people who like this reason is that, well, you have the chance of getting everything right. If you make all of your decisions correctly, you get the very best reading in every circumstance. And this is, in fact, the method that the Ben Chaim publication used. So Barry said, what criteria will determine the best reading? Well, it's the one that I like the best, if I'm the editor. You could go by a traditional thing that we've always heard that it should be this way. We could trust this manuscript more than the other, but it's an editorial judgment, and this is an example of how people with printing presses become very powerful because there's no oversight of the guy who's doing this. I mean, it's the publisher and it's Jacob Bar Chaim deciding which the best ones are, and the criteria they have are going to be the reading that they like the best, the one they think is right. The upside of the eclectic, is if you get all of the ones correct, then you've got all of the ones correct. The downside is you've created a text tradition that did not exist until you decided to write this book. You've created an edition of the Bible which does not reflect any manuscript tradition, because you're drawing from all of them. So you've created something new. You don't have an attachment to any one manuscript tradition, which is why over time the people have decided that we don't like this version so much. What we like to do is what's called the diplomatic approach. Which is to say, we pick the best manuscript, the one that we think is best, and that's usually the most complete manuscript. We present that, mistakes and all, and where we think there's a variation that needs to be recorded, we put a little note in the margin. And this gives us a true representative of a manuscript family. And then in the margins, you'll see where the variations are. The limitations of this is a very academic approach to it. I mean, if you're going to use something in the synagogue, I mean, do you want the approach that is more academically sound, or do you want the one where you think you're getting all of the best readings? So there's pros and cons for each of these schools, but because the Second Rabbinic Bible was an eclectic manuscript, it was because it was so influential. This really set the form of what the Hebrew Bible was for generations, maybe even till today. I don't know what the Chumashim that we have use. I mean, they probably use a variation of the Ben Chaim version rather than something that's an academic version of the Chumash. So I just want to spend some time and take you through what we have in a Rabbinic Bible. This is a picture of the Vilna edition of the Rabbinic Bible. This is sort of the standard one until 20 years ago or so. This was the first sefer that I bought. I bought this at Rosenberg's bookstore in J-Town, Pennsylvania, Jenkintown, and I remember it was $50 for the set of 5 books, and it was so I have some attachment to this, and I wish that when I had got it, there had been somebody to really give me a guide through it. I asked people for a comprehensive guide, and I was told that none existed. So hopefully, I mean, this guide won't be comprehensive, but this will be a start for people who want to look a little further. The first thing that we have, as I've said, is the text, and this is based on the Ben Chaim text. This is the Torah. And it's in big letters, so you can't miss it. And off to the side, as I mentioned before, and this goes back to the presentation of the very earliest Rabbinic Bibles, we have the Targum of Onkelos. And you can read that too. Just in one of the ways that the printing press has changed things, you can see that the Targum has little vowels. It has little dots, and of course those don't exist in the pre-printing press versions of this. But if you want to sell books, you have to make it as attractive as possible. I can't take you through all of the commentaries, and in this class we're not going to really examine a comment by them. I hope to do that in a later class, but I want to introduce you to what we call the Big Three. That in most Mikraot Gedolot or Rabbinic Bibles, the heart of the conversation is between 3 interpreters or authorities, all from the Middle Ages. And the first one, it should not be a surprise, is outlined here, is that of Rashi, the most famous Torah commentary of all time. So Rashi is born in France, in Troyes, France, in 1040. Very famously, he was a vintner. It was back when your job could not be to be a rabbi. You also had to do something useful and productive. But he wrote everybody knows about his commentaries to the Torah. But among the study halls, he's probably we have the most gratitude to him for his commentary to the Talmud. That his commentary to the Talmud actually makes it possible to read it. The Talmud, as you know, is in very difficult language. It's very terse. There's no punctuation at all. Some of it's in Aramaic. And with Rashi's commentary to the Talmud, you can actually sit down and make some sense of it. His Torah commentary, he strives to, he has a strong educational agenda. There are midrashim and traditions and laws that he feels that the reader should be aware of. And he also wants to demonstrate that particular things in the text that a close reading of the text would inspire questions to which these midrashim could potentially have an answer. It's one thing to be aware of when you're reading Rashi. It's not like our modern commentaries. I think that the way many people read the modern commentaries, if you're reading the Hertz Chumash, or you're reading what's the conservative one, the Eitz Chaim Chumash, you're reading along and you see something strange in the text, and you're like, I don't know what this is, and so your eyes drift below the line, and you look for something as an answer to it. I mean, that's for Rashi. It really goes in the other direction. That you read Rashi, and after you read Rashi, you realize that you need to study what's above the line much more carefully. It's like Jeopardy. It's everything's in reverse. And so what Rashi brings to the table is an intellectual exercise where he challenges you to read the commentary carefully, not to read the Torah quite carefully, and to answer the question as we ask it, what's bothering Rashi? What's Rashi's motivation? And the fact that his commentary is so insightful in this regard, that it's so beautifully written, that it connects to the text so many important midrashim. It's a favorite commentary of all people, and it inspires what's called super commentaries. For Rashi, I think there are more than 200. There's a debate. It depends what you have to be a super commentary. But a super commentary is when somebody reads Rashi in the same manner that Rashi reads the Torah. That's to say, Rashi reads the Torah very carefully, and the super commentaries on Rashi are all reading Rashi very carefully. And the fact that there is so much scholarship connected with Rashi is why you'll very often hear rabbis just say, well, we have a Rashi on this. He'll give the Rashi, and you know you're supposed to pay attention because this is a central place in the Jewish discussion about what the Torah means, what a given piece of the Torah means. Another way that Rashi shapes the way that we read Torah is that unlike many modern commentaries, Rashi's commentary is fragmentary. That's to say, he doesn't carry a theme over from one comment to the next usually. He might do so for one or two, but it's for every verse, for every word, most of the time you're starting over with that word or that verse, and you're examining the text at the micro level. I mean, this is the way the Rabbinic Midrashim read the Torah, and it's the way that Rashi continues to read the Torah, even though he does so in a more medieval rather than a midrashic style. The second member of the big three is Ibn Ezra. And I spoke when we saw the second Rabbinic Bible. It's important to spread around the commentaries because you want to sell your books to both Sephardim and to Ashkenazim. Ibn Ezra. And so, by the way, I put pictures on these things. I have no idea. I don't think anybody knows why this is a picture of Ibn Ezra. They all look the same. They're all a guy with a beard and sometimes a turban. So I don't know exactly why they think that this is a picture of Ibn Ezra, but you need a picture for something. So, and who knows, he might have actually looked like this. So, but Ibn Ezra, as I said, he was born in Spain in 1089. He was forced to leave Spain because of the Almodahi's, the unifiers of the name. These were the same people that the Maimonides family had to leave the Iberian Peninsula as well. He spent the bulk of his life in Northern Europe, where he spread the style of learning and scholarship that they had in the Sephardi world to Ashkenazi Jews. The real difference between Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews culturally were that the Sephardim lived in lands where Arabic was spoken. Arabic is, of course, rather close to Hebrew, and the knowledge of Arabic grammar and the closeness between Arabic and Hebrew allowed a very sophisticated school of biblical interpretation to rise up among the Sephardi Jews. It was much more linguistically and scientific than what was done in Northern Europe. Ibn Ezra was a Renaissance man. He wrote works of grammar. He wrote works in mathematics. He wrote works on astrology. And when you have to remember that we think of astrology as silliness. We think of astrology with Nancy Reagan and whatever. But, at the time, the line between astrology and astronomy was not all that dramatic. His commentary, so he writes a very basically a scientific commentary, so much so that when the modern reader consults Ibn Ezra, he understands some of the science is off because it's pre-Copernican, it's pre-modern, but the attitude and the motive. To have an evidence-based, an argument-based, philological-based understanding of the Bible is something that we are very familiar with. And in many ways, reading Ibn Ezra is like reading a modern commentary on the Torah. His commentary is famous among the humanists for its sadot, for the secrets. And that's to say that he, in his commentaries, he left little hints that were later picked up by people who wanted to have a documentary or a human-based, a non-Mosaic theory of how the Torah came to be written. He never says this explicitly, but he'll make the argument and then he'll say, it's a great secret, and he'll go on. And in one of these comments, he seems to be indicating that the second half of the book of Isaiah was not written by the prophet who wrote the first half of the book. At another point, he famously in the book of Genesis, on the comment of then the Canaanite was in the land, he seems to be suggesting that part of the Torah had to be post-Mosaic. At the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, he points out that it really seems that this book is written from the point of view of somebody in Jerusalem and not from the point of view of somebody in Moab. It's these little hints that people like Spinoza and Hobbes in the Enlightenment were going to seize onto when they begin their dissection of the Jewish scripture and try to argue that it's written by human beings and not by Moses and not by God. And so this is one way that his commentary has become popular. It's very exciting because you're trying to wonder exactly what he's saying. And like Rashi, he has been the object of numerous super commentaries. The third member of the big three is the Ramban. Nachmanides, Moshe ben Nachman, who was I'm in the way, but he was born in 1194 in Gerona, where he lived most of his life. He did make Aliyah when near the end of his life. His commentary, his commentary is very long. So there are very helpful people who lived after him, like Rabbeinu Bachia and Yaakov ben Asher, who wrote digests of his commentary, so you don't have to read the whole thing. He responds in his commentary to both Rashi and to Ibn Ezra. He will cite them by name. Sometimes he'll agree with them. Sometimes he'll argue with them. But the fact that he responds to both of them is what makes this the triad, that it makes them inseparable, that it's really almost a conversation between the three commentators when you read them. And he gets to speak last because he died after everyone else did. Though Nachmanides was also famously a disputationist, when he was in Spain, it was becoming fully Christian, and he would be called in to debate the priests, and some of those disputations are preserved for us. He was a great opponent of Maimonides. He devotes no small amount of his Torah commentary to taking on some of the arguments advanced by Maimonides in the Guide for the Perplexed. And Nachmanides is also a great Kabbalist. He works very hard to try to make ideas of Kabbalah mainstream. And so he refers to Sodot and esoteric things in his commentary, but it's usually to a Kabbalistic or a mystical idea that he wants to allude to, so that the reader can, if the reader is worthy, somebody else will explain to him what he's talking about. So these are the big three. And what's notable about this, one is to see how conservative the first editions and subsequent editions of the Mikraot Gedolot became. Conservative in the sense that all of these guys lived at least 300 years before the printing press was able to publish their works. They reflect a very, on the one hand, they reflect a rather early layer of medieval Jewish Bible commentary. But on the other hand, it's remarkable just how different they are. And the fact that we always read the Torah alongside the voices of these three very different individuals, of Rashi, the midrashist, and the great educator, with Ibn Ezra, who's the great scientist and the great linguist, and Nachmanides, the great conservative, the great Kabbalist. The fact that we experience their voices all together, for people on the inside, and I wish that I wish to bring more people onto this inside, but it makes a statement that there really are. I don't know if there are 70 faces to Torah, but there are certainly many different ways to experience Torah. And it's certainly something wonderful to have all of these different perspectives talking to you on the same page. A friend of mine, he was always, whenever he was going off to study, he would say, "No, I'm always going to go study with my friend Nachmanides." And to have the fact that we're able to have these sorts of relationships with these people who lived long, long ago, but because of the variety of their arguments, we almost always find something that resonates with us. Is a great wonder of this tradition of Jewish publishing that began in the 16th century. It did not end, of course, in the 16th century, and people continued to do their books for hundreds of years afterwards. And people would pick different things to do. It wasn't always the big three. I mean, the big three were considered to be the core of the curriculum, but people did books that didn't have them. This is a copy of this is a Rabbinic Bible published by Eliyahu ben Mosaics, and we see so he published this in Livorno in the second half of the 19th century, and we see some things here that are familiar. We see the text of the Torah here. We see Onkelos here. We see our friend Rashi here. Right here beside Rashi, Sifatai Kohanim, this is a super commentary on Rashi, which has made its way into many editions of the Rabbinic Bible. So this is about him. And for the additional things, Ben Mosig was a Kabbalist, so he picked teachers that would interest him. Moshe Alshek, who's a 16th century writer from Asia Minor, who wrote homiletical and quasi-mystical interpretations, and David Azulai, who was another Kabbalist. And Ben Mosig also adds his own commentary to this version. So in the years since 1600, you did see a move to make rabbinic Bibles that would break the monopoly of the early Middle Age writers, that would break the mold a little bit, to include more Kabbalistic and more Hasidic style writings. Where we are today is sort of a bit of a return to the classics as new editions of the Mikraot Gedolot continue to be published. This one here is called the Torat Chaim, published by Mossad Harav Kook. And I'd say that this is sort of the standard copy that people buy today if they're interested. It's a couple things that should be you should be interested in about this. One, everything here is in square print, because Israelis don't do by Rashi script, and there's no reason to have that in a modern book. Let me show you what Rashi script is, by the way, and explain that. You see on this thing here, we have the regular square. The square print up here. This more fancier script here is called Rashi script. It's not called Rashi script because Rashi wrote in that script. He did not write in that script. This is actually a Sephardi script. It's called Rashi script because Rashi was printed in that script. And the real reason Rashi is printed in that script is simply to make it easier to, if you have a bunch of the same font together, it could potentially be confusing to read. But in the modern forms here, you see that everything is in square. And you don't see, and this is a return to the big three and maybe some other medievals. You have your Rashi, your Ibn Ezra, your Ramban, and a few other people, but no Kabbalistic commentaries, no Hasidic commentaries. We are becoming more traditional in that regard. And there's also this is the Mikraot Gedolot HaKeter being published in pieces by Bar Ilan University. Again, everything in square script, as we saw before. What this edition brings to the table that sets it apart is, remember I was telling you that the difference between an eclectic and a diplomatic version. Historically, we've always preferred eclectic, but in scholarship we prefer diplomatic. The Mikraot Gedolot is a diplomatic version of the Rabbinic Bible. That's to say, all of the text of the Torah is from a single manuscript with notes. Also, the text of the commentaries are scientifically designed. So this is the new academic version, and it. So buy this for your friends. The question that people ask about now usually is, well, is there anything here for me if I don't read Hebrew? And I think that there is some exploration that can be done. Michael Karasik in Philadelphia has translated most of the Mikraot Gedolot into English editions. And some of it is really very interesting. If you wanted to look at a page of this in English, I think he's done Exodus. I think he's done everything but Genesis. But the Jewish Publication Society, which I'm not sure even exists anymore, but they were publishing it, and whoever they sold themselves to is continuing to publish it. And so that's an option for somebody who does not have the facility in Hebrew to tackle this. But you should probably try to do as much Hebrew as you can. I think that there's a lot there. There's a lot there for those who would be interested. The final thing that I would note is that we are coming to the very end of the the printing age, and many people who study these texts do not experience them anymore in the form of a published book, but in an electronic version. This is a screenshot of the Bar Ilan Responsa database. And the Bar Ilan Responsa database has basically every sefer a regular Jew could ever need or want. It all sits on the computer, and you call them up as you want. But it's just like the internet is different than reading a newspaper. Using this responsa is different than reading a sefer. The publisher has a lot less control over what people are going to be reading, how they're going to read it, how they're going to even arrange it on the computer. You can set it up however you wish to. And it remains to be seen, I think, how this affects Jewish culture. I mean, certainly the presence of the Rabbinic Bible, by the fact that there was a culture of having a certain text, having commentators that were canonized, not by the tradition, but by the fact that they were popular, and creating, therefore, a common culture of Bible study. That had a tremendous impact on how Jews read the Bible. And I'm guessing that as things become more digital, that's going to have an impact as well. I wouldn't want to hazard a guess as to what it is. But that's the story, briefly, a brief tour of the Rabbinic Bible, the Mikraot Gedolot. It's 8:15. I've done my allotted 45 minutes, and I'll take any questions. Florence asked how mystical was Nachmanides. He was somebody who was convinced of the truth of the Kabbalah. His understanding of what the Torah is permeated with a Kabbalistic understanding. That to the point where for a Kabbalist, you could see the Torah on many different levels. On one hand, you have a simple level. On one hand, you have Midrash. On the other level, you have secrets. You could also look at the whole thing as one long name of God. And all of those mystical understandings of the Torah and how to read the Torah can be found in the writings of Nachmanides. A Kabbalist was a big part of what he was. And that's not always recognized by people, because we're coming out of a period where rationality is prized, and so people tend to hide that. But he was the real McCoy. He was the real McCoy. Barry writes, so the Zohar and other Kabbalistic are a form of Torah commentaries. It would be nice to have a class focusing on Kabbalistic, Hasidic, and Midrashic Torah commentaries. I wish I knew more about those things. We could certainly study some of them together. Maybe the medievals are different, and I don't think that it's. I think it's fortunate that they ended up placed in the middle of this mainstream tradition. But it's nice to have. It's certainly nice to have the Kabbalah and other things on the side. It would be interesting, I think, to look. What I'd like to do is pick a particular verse or something, and then go through the three big guys in accordance with that verse, and then maybe we could branch out and see how the Kabbalists look at that and how the Chassids look at that. Okay, I thank you for coming, and I look forward to seeing you in person or virtually. Everybody have a wonderful evening. So Florence Gardner, would Nachmanides be opposed to the viewpoints of Ibn Ezra as well as Maimonides? Well, he often was opposed to them. He was opposed to the as a mystic. You're opposed to the rationalist school. He disagrees a lot with Ibn Ezra. His disagreements with Ibn Ezra never seem to have the venom, though, that he subjects Maimonides to. Clearly, he might disagree with Ibn Ezra. He saw Maimonides as dangerous, so that would be the difference. And I hope that everyone has a happy Independence Day. And sei gesund.